The sun was sinking low, turning the windshield into a sheet of burning gold, when my phone started vibrating in the cup holder and my hands went numb before I even touched it. The road blurred. The air felt too thick to breathe. And somewhere deep in my chest, a quiet voice told me this was the moment my life split cleanly in two. I remember the smell of hot asphalt, the ticking sound of the engine, and the way my heart began to pound like it was trying to escape. If you're watching this and you've ever felt that sudden dread before bad news arrives, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because stories like this don't happen as rarely as we want to believe. I pulled over, staring at the steering wheel as fear settled into my bones, already knowing nothing after this call would be simple again. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I was driving home just before sunset when my phone vibrated against the console, an unfamiliar number lighting the screen. The voice on the other end was tight and breathless, and before I could steady myself, I knew something was terribly wrong. I am in my mid-50s, a widow, a retired nurse, someone who has lived in this small town long enough to recognize danger before it explains itself. As the road blurred past my windshield, my hands locked around the steering wheel and my chest hollowed out. The words I heard did not land like information. They landed like impact. I felt it in my wrists, my jaw, the way my foot pressed harder on the gas without conscious thought. Years of night shifts and emergency rooms had taught me the sound of fear, and this was it, raw and unfinished. I remember thinking how ordinary everything looked. The fading light, the quiet traffic, the lie of normalcy that survives right up until it doesn't. Somewhere ahead of me, my daughter was alone, hurt, and running out of time, and every instinct I had as a mother told me this was no accident. I did not weigh options. I did not hesitate. I turned the car around in the middle of the road, gravel spraying as I committed. I drove with the windows down, the air sharp against my face, trying to keep my thoughts from racing faster than the road. People talk about instincts like they are vague feelings, but mine have always been shaped by evidence, just not the kind you can write down. I spent almost 30 years as a nurse in this county hospital. I have seen accidents, real ones, and I have seen what happens when harm is intentional. They do not feel the same in your body. I have lived in this town my entire life. The roads repeat themselves. The families do too. You learn patterns without realizing you are learning them. That is how mothers survive here. That is how I survived after my husband died, and it was just my daughter and me against the quiet. My daughter, Emily, was never careless. She noticed details other people missed. When she married into money and moved into a world where doors opened easily, I told myself the distance was normal. New marriage, new expectations. I wanted to believe comfort explained her shorter calls and careful words, but as the miles passed under my tires, denial stopped working. Nobody ends up hurt and alone in a place that far from town by coincidence. Someone chose isolation. Someone chose darkness. Someone believed they would not be questioned. I felt it settle in my chest, heavy and certain. This was not bad luck. This was intention. And I was driving straight toward where that intention had been carried out. No turning back now. I turned onto the dirt road just as the light finished draining from the sky. The pavement disappeared behind me, replaced by ruts, mud, and trees closing in from both sides. This quarry used to be loud once. I remembered trucks, voices, machinery. Now it was an abandoned wound in the land, avoided, forgotten, chosen for exactly those reasons. Every bump jarred my bones as I drove deeper, my headlights cutting narrow tunnels through fog and branches. No one drifts out here. You come because you mean to. That certainty tightened with every yard. This was not a place for accidents. This was a place for silence. Then I saw the pickup truck pulled off near the tree line. Its engine was off. One man stood beside it, shifting his weight, the only movement in a landscape that felt wrong for holding any life at all. I stopped before the car fully settled and got out, my feet hitting the ground already moving. The woods swallowed sound. Branches snapped against my arms as I ran. Wet leaves slid under my shoes. I fell once, scraped skin. Didn't slow. My eyes searched the ground ahead, bracing for what I expected to find. At first, my mind refused the shape lying there. It was too still, too small, wrong in every way. Then I saw movement, a shallow rise, a breath that barely made it back out. She was alive. The world narrowed to that single truth, and everything else went quiet as I dropped beside her, shock giving way to something sharper. Training stirred under the fear, counting breaths, assessing damage, knowing the next seconds would decide everything for us both there. I knelt beside her and forced myself to breathe. Panic wanted to take over, but muscle memory stepped in first. I looked at her airway, the rise and fall of her chest, the color of her skin, shallow breaths, uneven rhythm, alive, but barely holding the line. Her face was swollen, one eye nearly shut. Blood dried into her hair. An arm lay at an angle no arm should rest, and I did not touch it. Years in emergency rooms had taught me that good intentions can make damage worse. I spoke inside my head, steady and clinical, the same way I always had on night shifts when families were watching me for answers I did not yet have. I counted breaths. I checked pupils. I listened past my heart pounding in my ears. Fear was there, but it was contained, pressed flat under training. What struck me most was not the pain. It was the fear. A deep, urgent fear that did not match a simple assault. This was the fear of someone who expected to be finished. As she stirred, fragments spilled out between shallow breaths, not as conversation, but as pieces of memory I caught and held. She had confronted someone. She had seen something she was never meant to see. There was anger, then calculation, then the deliberate choice to leave her where no one would hear her. When the truth finally settled, it landed cold and precise. This was not a stranger. This was family. A woman with money, influence, and a reputation polished bright enough to blind anyone who did not look closely. I felt something change in me then, because if that was true, survival would not be decided by medicine alone. It would be decided by who world chose to believe. As I steadied her breathing, I realized the fear in her eyes was not just about pain or shock. It was about where help usually comes from. Hospitals, police, paper trails. She was afraid of all of it, and that terrified me more than her injuries. I had spent my career believing in systems. I knew the protocols, the safeguards, the way things were supposed to work when someone was hurt. But I also knew how influence travels quietly through hallways and offices. I had seen it before. Donors with names on wings, families whose calls were returned first, charts handled more gently when certain last names appeared. My daughter had married into that world. I understood now that she knew things I did not. She knew how quickly truth could be buried under money and lawyers and polite disbelief. As I held her there in the dirt, I could feel that understanding pressing into me, rewriting everything I thought I knew about safety. In the distance, sirens began to rise, faint at first, then clearer. Normally, that sound brings relief. That night, it brought dread. I thought about my training, the oath I took, the rules that had guided my hands for decades. Then I thought about my child, broken and shaking, certain that official help would finish what had already been started. My grandfather's voice came back to me then, calm and unsentimental. He used to say that when the system belongs to someone else, survival means staying quiet and choosing carefully. The sirens were closer now. I felt the weight of the choice forming inside me, heavy and unavoidable. Whatever I did next would change everything. I stood and looked back toward the road, listening to the sirens threading closer through the trees. A man hovered near his truck, unsure. Waiting for instructions I knew I could not give out loud. I convinced him quietly, not with lies, but with certainty, that this was something I would handle myself. In that moment, I stopped weighing rules. I accepted responsibility. Whatever followed would be mine to carry. I felt the shift clearly, like stepping over a line drawn only for me. I was no longer a nurse protected by policy or a citizen sheltered by procedure. I was a mother choosing survival. I moved carefully, every motion deliberate. I stabilized what I could, supported what I could not, and helped my daughter inch toward the car. Each step hurt her, and I absorbed it with her, counting breaths, watching her face, refusing panic. I buckled her in the passenger seat the way I had when she was small, hands steady even as my chest shook. The lights grew brighter behind us as I pulled away without turning on my headlights until the trees swallowed the road. I knew then that whatever protection systems offer had been left behind in the dirt. I did not feel reckless. I felt resolved. The choice had been made, and there was no appeal. From that point forward, survival mattered more than permission, and the truth would have to wait until my daughter was safe. That certainty guided every mile that followed. We drove in silence for several miles, the road unspooling ahead of us while she gathered the strength to speak. When she did, it was not dramatic. It was careful, measured, like someone who had already practiced telling the truth and learned how dangerous it was. She had found records months earlier, financial transfers that did not line up with the charity's public image. On paper, everything looked clean. In reality, money moved through empty companies, names that led nowhere, accounts tied to people who had no idea they were listed. She had followed the patterns the way she always did, patiently, quietly, until the shape of it became undeniable. She told me she confronted her mother-in-law because she believed honesty still mattered. She believed there would be an explanation, maybe even relief. Instead, she was treated like a threat. What she thought would be a conversation turned into a plan to isolate her, to move her away from witnesses, to remind her where power really lived. As she spoke, I understood that what happened at the quarry was not impulsive. It was prepared, chosen. The violence was not rage. It was risk management. Then she told me the part that changed everything. She had expected this. Not the timing, not the brutality, but the refusal to be believed. So she had prepared. She had taken pictures, copied files, stored records in places that did not trace back to her name, proof that could not be explained away as confusion or bitterness. I felt the fear shift then, sharpening into something else. This was no longer just about getting home alive. This was leverage, and leverage meant danger did not end at escape. It followed, watched, waited. For a few minutes, the road felt almost normal again. My daughter's breathing steadied. The engine hummed. Relief tried to creep in, and that was when something small and wrong surfaced in my mind. It was a memory I had brushed aside earlier, last spring. When my son-in-law insisted on having my car serviced at their place, he had framed it as generosity, family looking out for family. I had not questioned it. I rarely did when things were offered so smoothly. The thought would not let go. I pulled over beneath a stand of bare trees and shut off the engine. The night felt suddenly close. I took my flashlight and slid down onto the cold ground, gravel biting into my palms as I crawled beneath the frame. It did not take long. A small black box, clean and newly mounted, wires tucked with care. Not debris, not coincidence, intention, again. I ripped it free and set it on the ground, my hands steady, my breathing controlled. There was no rush of panic, just clarity. They had not been waiting to react. They had been watching the entire time. Everything rearranged itself in that moment. The offers of help, the convenient concern, the sense of being guided instead of supported. It had never been care. It had been control. I stood, wiped my hands on my jeans, and looked at the dark road ahead. Escape was no longer enough. We needed someone who understood planning, silence, and how to disappear without being erased. I already knew who that was. I did not hesitate before calling my brother. When things fall apart, he is the one who stays still. He answered on the first ring. No questions, just a calm promise that he was already on his way. He arrived before dawn, his truck lights cutting clean lines across the yard. He looked at my face, then at my daughter, and nodded once. That was all. He had spent years in logistics and emergency planning, the kind of work where panic gets people killed and quiet preparation saves them. Within minutes, my kitchen stopped being a kitchen. Maps came out, phones were powered down, windows were covered. He moved with certainty, not urgency, and the house followed his rhythm. I realized my shoulders had finally dropped. I focused on my daughter while he worked. Clean bandages, careful checks, no drama. That was when I noticed what shock had hidden. Her body was protecting more than itself. The test confirmed it. She was pregnant. The air changed, not louder, heavier. My brother absorbed the information without flinching. He adjusted the plan without saying why it mattered. It mattered to all of us. We stood together in the quiet, 3 generations suddenly bound by the same threat. Whatever this was, it was no longer just about escape. It was about protecting a future that someone else had decided to erase. My brother finally spoke with his actions, not his voice. He packed what mattered, left what did not, and looked toward the road. I understood. Staying was no longer an option now. We left the house before the sun fully rose, taking back roads until even the map felt unsure of us. The cabin sat deep in state land, old timber and stone tucked between pines, reachable only by a narrow trail my brother had memorized years ago. When we arrived, the quiet was complete. No cell signal, no nearby roads, just wind in the trees and the slow creak of wood settling. My brother walked the perimeter first, checking sightlines, clearing tracks, erasing our arrival. Only then did he nod. Inside. I settled my daughter on the narrow bed. I cleaned wounds again, adjusted splints, monitored her breathing. For the first time since the quarry, she slept without fear tightening her face. I let myself rest exactly as long as it took to boil water. While I worked, my brother gathered information the old-fashioned way, printed records, offline drives, names that repeated too often, patterns that did not belong to coincidence. What emerged was not a reckless man covering a mistake. It was someone methodical, insulated, and patient. That understanding changed the cabin. It stopped being a hiding place and became a workspace. Safety here was real, but it was provisional. As night settled, I stood on the porch and looked into the dark. Accusations would never touch someone like this. Power like that does not defend itself. It waits, and we had to decide how to meet it, together, now. I stopped thinking about justice the way ordinary people do. Reports, audits, hearings. Those are tools meant for people who fear them. The information my brother gathered made something plain. This man survived scrutiny because scrutiny was built around him. I had worked inside systems long enough to recognize the pattern. Complaints disappeared into procedure. Investigations widened until responsibility dissolved. Truth was not denied. It was buried under compliance and delay until it became harmless. What finally cut through the noise was not money. It was reputation. Power protects itself by appearing stable, faithful, inevitable. And buried in the records was the one thing never meant to surface: a long, carefully concealed affair, not reckless, not romantic, strategic, hidden in shell addresses, favors, and travel routed through other names. That changed everything. The goal was never to punish him. Men like that absorb punishment and emerge cleaner. The goal was predictability. Leverage forces behavior. Exposure narrows choices. And then I understood where the real access point lived. Not with him, but with his husband. A man whose career depended on appearances, whose silence was an asset, whose belief in control was absolute. Power does not fear accusations. It fears witnesses, timing, and a stage it cannot leave. And for the first time, the board was visible, and the next move required light, not hiding. Public places, public records, and public moments would force answers where private pleas never could again now. I chose a place designed for waiting: glass walls, open tables, people passing with phones in their hands, the kind of space where voices lower themselves automatically. Visibility was not a risk, it was armor. I arrived early and sat where cameras were obvious. I did not rehearse what I would say. There was nothing to argue. When he arrived, I felt the familiar pressure of proximity, but it no longer carried weight. Everything that mattered was already documented. I laid the evidence out quietly: timelines, financial records, copies stored where I could not erase them even if I wanted to. I did not explain motives or injuries. Facts do not need emotion to be dangerous. Then I acknowledged the pregnancy, not as leverage, but as truth. A future that required distance, safety, and permanence. Something that could not survive intimidation or silence. There was no negotiation. Money never entered my thinking. I was clear about boundaries and outcomes. No contact, no retaliation, no corrections made in private. Any breach would move this into places neither of us controlled. I watched the calculation happen, power adjusting to exposure, the realization that noise would only amplify what I already held. When he left, nothing dramatic followed. No apology, no threat, just agreement shaped by inevitability. I stayed seated, steady, knowing the hardest part was over, and that what came next would happen quietly, exactly as planned, without spectacle, witnesses, or permission. I expected fallout to be loud. It wasn't. It arrived quietly, in small absences that accumulated into certainty. Invitations stopped. Meetings were canceled. A name that once dominated rooms began to fade from schedules and headlines alike. There were no dramatic statements or public reckonings. Instead, paperwork moved. Accounts were closed. Positions shifted sideways and then disappeared. The kind of consequences that do not trend, but permanently alter access and reach. For us, safety finalized itself in practical ways. Locks changed. Numbers went dark. Legal boundaries were formalized without resistance. No calls followed. No warnings. Silence held. I stayed alert longer than necessary, waiting for retaliation that never came. Each uneventful morning loosened something in my chest. Power, once cornered, had chosen retreat over exposure. The greatest proof came at night. My daughter slept without flinching at passing cars or distant sounds. Her body stopped bracing for impact. Rest returned slowly, then fully. There was no victory speech, no moment of triumph, just relief settling in layers. Justice did not announce itself. It resolved. As the days steadied, my focus shifted inward, toward healing and the long work of rebuilding trust, strength, and a future measured not by fear, but by endurance. That quiet survival became the lesson I carried forward, preparing me to define what living actually meant after everything that had been taken and narrowly protected from us. After the danger passed, nothing felt cinematic. Life returned in ordinary motions: groceries, appointments, morning light through familiar windows. That was when I understood survival had a longer timeline than fear. My daughter changed first. Her shoulders stopped curling inward. She met rooms with steadiness instead of apology. Decisions came from choice, not anticipation of punishment. Watching that shift taught me more than any crisis ever did. When my granddaughter was born, the room felt anchored, not celebratory, just solid. A future arriving without debt to the past. Holding her made the meaning unmistakable. Survival was not about what we escaped. It was about what we were finally free to build. I learned that strength is quieter than I was taught. It lives in boundaries held consistently, not in confrontations won once. It appears when help is accepted without shame, and when walking away is chosen without explanation. Power lost its shine. Control lost its appeal. What mattered was agency, the ability to decide where we lived, who had access, and what we carried forward. Survival, I realized, is clarity that endures. It is peace maintained through ordinary days. It is the freedom to grow without bracing for impact. And once you recognize it, you stop chasing victory and start protecting the life you chose to keep. That understanding is what I want to leave with you here today now. I am not the same woman who answered that phone call, and I am grateful for that. I learned that strength does not announce itself. It prepares quietly. It protects without asking permission. Life went back to normal on the surface, but I did not. I notice patterns now. I trust discomfort. I choose boundaries early instead of explaining them late. That change did not harden me. It clarified me. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, I want you to hear this clearly. Protecting yourself is not cruelty. Walking away is not weakness. Silence can be wisdom, and preparation can be love. We are taught that survival must look dramatic to be real. I have learned the opposite. Real survival is calm. It is boring in the best way. It is choosing peace again and again, even when no one is watching. Today my life is ordinary, and that is the victory. Ordinary mornings, honest relationships, a future that feels open instead of threatening. If you have lived through something like this, or if you are sensing the early signs now, you are not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments if you feel ready. I read everyone, and I believe our quiet truths matter. Thank you for listening and for holding space with me.